second and final session. Folks will be trickling in once they hear my voice. What I'd like to do is introduce a colleague of mine in African American Studies, professor of history, Professor Ashley Farmer, who will be introducing and hosting the next speaker. So Ashley, please.
All right, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aleia M. Brown, and she is the program manager of a Humanities Action Lab at Rutgers Newark and a recipient of the 2017 Mellon American Council of Learned Societies Public Fellowship. She is the co-founder of two digital humanities projects, #BlackTwitterStorians and #Museums Respond to Ferguson. As the former curator of the African American History and Culture at the Michigan State University Museum, she primarily worked with the, what's the correct way to say this? Mazalumi Women of Color Quilters Network collection and made the work accessible through the Quilt Index and traveling exhibitions. And her work is really cool. Is your dissertation accessible now? I don't know. If not, forthcoming articles, but her work is dope on the quilts, and she really did kind of excavate and create a whole archive that's quite amazing. Her current manuscript project looks at how Black women textile artists have interpreted ideologies from the Black arts movement to the feminist arts movement. And I'm just also personally really excited to have Aleia here. I was sharing with others that Aleia and her co-creator of the #BlackTwitterStorians is like single-handedly in charge of getting a whole generation of folks like me on Twitter. They invited us to be part of these what would you call them? I guess they're chats, right? I still don't know the terms. And we all were like, no, we don't know how to do this. What is Twitter? We can't get on here. And they kind of held our hands, and now we all feel very proficient and engaged and happy to be a part of a different level of community in history. And I think that's in large part a testament to the kind of work that Aleia does both online and offline. So please welcome her to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Farmer, thank you for that kind and generous introduction. Also, I have to say thank you to the organizers. I'm very pleased to be here. And to just think about this new iteration of the Black freedom struggle and how it intersects with digital humanities, and mostly in particular, social media. So today my talk is entitled Control, Alt, Delete, Reimagining Digital Communities as Restorative Action. I didn't prepare a typical paper because I kind of wanted to give you all a bit of a narrative about how I co-created these two spaces or chats, and then also give you some demonstrations about how they work. So the spaces that I started, Museums Respond to Ferguson and BlackTwitterStorians, just to give you a bit of the landscape about how they came into being. They both started while I was finishing up my doc program. So it's largely informed with me learning public history, refining my thoughts on public history, and then also seeing this wave of social movement, this wave of the movement for Black lives, and realizing that there's a huge dissonance between what was happening in the classroom and the discourse with my colleagues and what was going on in my organizing spaces. So both of these hashtags, kind of what I was hoping and what my colleagues who helped me create this were to resolve the dissonance between the two. So I'll just start talking a little bit about Museums Respond to Ferguson. So this quote that you see here is from Elizabeth Merritt. She's the founding director of the Center for the Future of Museums. This is a section within the American Alliance for Museums, which is like the granting agency. So like anytime a museum is looking to be accredited, they go through the American Alliance for Museums. So Elizabeth says, quote, responding to thoughts about Ferguson, but I get uncomfortable when high-profile coverage by the press results in pressure for all museums issues of the day or week or month. So this is just one example, but it was largely resonant throughout the field. A lot of people took the stance that they didn't want to talk about Ferguson, and that was kind of it. But I kept pushing. I wanted to know more, and I also wanted to know, like, how can we collect the material culture? I'm a curator by trade, so I wanted to know what is the material culture that we need to be collecting that's coming out of these protests, like the signage, the T-shirts, even like the shells from the different bombs that people are using. So all of that is material culture that you use to build a historical narrative, but in both academia and practice, this was absent. So I started Museums Respond to Ferguson just to dig a little bit deeper, and it's a monthly Twitter chat. And I'll just show you all what it looks like. So as you see here, this is an example of how we archived the chats through Storify. So essentially, people log onto Twitter, and each month, I would co-host dialogues about Ferguson. So through these chats and dialogues, we developed a framework for how to look at anti-Blackness, state-sanctioned violence, vigilante violence within the scope of museums. The first thing that we came up with, which counteracts what the previous quote that I showed you all before, is that Ferguson it's a history, it's not a contemporary issue. So the main pushback that museums were having, that the reason why they didn't want to address Ferguson, because they were saying, it's a headline, we don't know what's gonna happen. We don't know who the key players are yet, so why should we cover it? And our argument was that state-sanctioned violence has a long history in the United States. Our other argument is that Ferguson is not just one place. So as we saw within the next coming years, the same thing happened in Baltimore, the same thing happened in Beaver Creek, Newark, Watts. You can go through the continuum of the United States history and see that this is not just restricted to Ferguson. So these chats helped us to develop a framework for how museums can think about contested issues and racialized oppression within museums. But just going back to the chat, generally how it works is I or one of my colleagues ask questions, and people answer the questions, and they are all documented and recorded through Storify. So this is a little bit of what it looks like. And then also, there are some examples of museums responding to Ferguson. So for example, I think, let's see. Anyway, someone in this particular chat brings up how eventually the Missouri Historical Society was kind of pushed by their own community to start collecting and having dialogue based on what they were collecting through the protests. And then it's gone the other way. Like, for example, the Minnesota Historical Society, when they hosted the Race, Are We So Different exhibition, it's kind of like an anthropological exhibit. They made a text panel that was kind of like saying, we regret the loss of Philando Castile. But they were pushed by their board to take it down. So we've seen how museums sometimes will take a certain step to acknowledge racialized violence, but then either their board or the community, their surrounding communities, push them to take a step back. So that's also been interesting to see how people react to how the different publics are reacting to them trying to talk about more contested issues. So again, this was co-created in 2014, and at that time, it was within the thread of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then also, our main thing that we've came out of it now is that this is a history and not a headline, and we should deal with it as such. So that's kind of the framework for that project. So beyond that, we started moving to in-person dialogues, and we actually got invited by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center to do a live dialogue and a pop-up exhibit, which was part of their intersectionality cultural lab. So and then we also did another culture lab at the Museum Computer Network. So in addition to bringing our thoughts beyond the digital space, it's also kind of a disruption of power, right? Because we're now getting into spaces that probably wouldn't have talked about Ferguson, probably wouldn't have talked about racialized violence. And actually, the photo on the left ended with a dance party at the Smithsonian Arts and Industry Building, which was incredible. And people don't typically think of museums as spaces as such, spaces that challenge white supremacy and spaces that celebrate Black women leadership. So we're not only just kind of filling a void, but also projecting the future of what we want museums to look like. And that's why we think that this is a radical project. So again, in addition to that, there are other spaces who've kind of adopted this model or worked with us to do programming, which includes the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I call it Blacksonian for short. The Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, Visitors of Color. This is a web-based platform and also on Tumblr. I encourage you all to visit it. But essentially, they have changed the way we think about museum viewers. They have started interviewing visitors of color, particularly in museums in Chicago, and posting their stories online about how they feel in museum spaces and what they like to see in museums. And that is also something that's very radical, because oftentimes when museums talk about their visitors, they're talking about a very specific public, which is usually very white, very middle class, and usually above 40. So this project here, which kind of dovetailed off of ours, changes the narrative. They're making museums pay attention to different publics beyond the ones that they have typically served. Another project that we have worked with is Museum Workers Speak, which looks at labor violations in museums. So people started dissecting other levels of oppression. They started realizing, oh, wow, this project is talking about racism, but there's also a problem with how we get people into the field, that you essentially have to come from a very wealthy family, because a lot of the inroads into museums are through free internships. So, this is another level of oppression that people are looking at. And then the Two Brown Girls Museum blog. And then also there are a few others, Arts.Black, which is a Black art criticism blog. So again, we're shifting who is the authority and who gets a platform. So I think that that's something very interesting that has came out of this particular project. So now on to Black Twitter historians, which we started shortly after Museums Respond to Ferguson. Similar in the same vein, it was also founded because there was, again, a gap. We were noticing that a lot of professors, the works that they cite were solely by white authors. So that's a problem, but it also has larger implications. Like, for example, that the people who create knowledge are only white. So we wanted to counteract that, but then also to build a community. So we wanted to raise the level of awareness and visibility of Black scholars, and then build a community and help Black graduate students understand that they weren't simply siloed in their respective programs. So this is an example of one of our first flyers. We started in February of 2014 for Black History Month. And the main things that, this is also a Born Digital project. It's also a dialogue-based project, which is also documented on Storify. And this particular chat, Dr. Ashley Farmer was our moderator. It was on Black Power, Misconceptions, Ideology, and Legacy. So as you see, we asked questions, Dr. Farmer fielded questions, and then also interacted with people. And it's all documented here. So this is also, it did something that we weren't actually aware of that was happening, but it broke down a barrier. You can see that there, well, you probably aren't aware of it, but there are graduate students interacting with associate professors and interacting with assistant professors, and then interacting with librarians and archivists. So this platform essentially gave people to connect with people at this point all over the world about different topics of Black history that they probably would have never been able to do. And then the second thing that we have recently moved into doing, in addition to like the monthly chats, we also do these things called moments on Twitter. So if you ever log into Twitter, you'll see that usually it's like a news story, and it kind of collects tweets about a particular topic that's happening at that time. So we decided to do them kind of randomly. So the Twitter chats are scheduled once a month, but the moments just kind of happen based on historicizing something that's very contemporary. So for Women's History Month, we did a moment on Gloria Richardson, and the idea is to give people a historical reference to something that is happening in the present. So we use archival scans of photos, and then we give people background of a certain person's life, and then talk about how it relates to this point in time. So Josh and I, my co-creator, what we did, we specifically started doing these moments to teach other people how to create them, so that when you start looking at the landscape of who's using Twitter and what they're doing with it, now it includes more people using history to talk about contemporary ideas, but also inserting Black history into contemporary ideas. This was really important to us because it then made the Twitter chat go beyond the two of us, because now there's a whole team of people who know how to effectively use these moments and how to deploy them and how to learn from them. And it's just a great skill to have. So this, in addition to being inspired by kind of like the contemporary movement, we do look to two people who are pictured here. The first is Carter G. Woodson. Many identify him as the father of Black history. And also people don't necessarily use this type of language, but a public historian. He was interested in engaging public ideas. He created Black History Month and so on, so forth. So we were interested in drawing on this long tradition of Black scholars in public and engaging public debate. The next is Anna Julia Cooper, who again was also very much a public-facing scholar and a truth teller in her own right. So we looked to these two to point to how the trajectory of people in the early 20th century all the way until the present, engaging public ideas and historicizing them. So this was our founding. And then that project grew out of a deeper community. So at the time I was in grad school in Nashville, so it ended up being part of the public meetings for Black Lives Matter Nashville. Then we also started interacting with the African American Intellectual History Society. And then, so I think now what we're looking at is how to collect the data and make use of it in a more sophisticated way. And there's a new app called DocNow, who we have been working with about how to collect this data and make larger arguments about Black historians using Twitter and what that has on the impact of the public. So this app is still in development, but it will be out pretty soon. And then I thought I could just have a discussion with you all and take questions about the two projects, if there are any.
Hi, my name is Nairobi. How did you decide on Twitter as the most effective medium to address this hashtag or this kind of campaign?
Yeah, so Twitter, there are a few reasons why we intentionally went to Twitter first. The first is that there's a large population of Black users on Twitter. There's a lot of data collected about how Black people use Twitter and why, so we figured that our audience was already built in there. The people who we wanted to have these conversations with were already there. The second is that at the time, it was a very democratized platform. So thinking about Facebook, you had to have a college address, like an email address to sign in. Twitter, you just need any type of email address. So we wanted wide participation, and we wanted an already built-in audience, and that's how we decided on Twitter.
Sorry, I'm coming.
Thanks so much. I'm just thinking about that question also in terms of my research is in Colombia. I'm interested in Black Colombia, where they don't have Twitter really. People are on WhatsApp, which is a totally different kind of platform.
Yeah.
But even aside from the issue of the particular platforms, I'm curious how what you do interacts with more traditional museum sort of spaces. How much is this stuff sort of taken up by these kinds of institutions which are slow moving, and to what degree are those institutions themselves starting to project themselves into online platforms or social media platforms?
Yeah, so first, talking about the effect that it has had on museums, they're still institutions. And I always preface anytime anyone talks about social change that it's possible, but there's a limit to how much an institution, we just have to be real about that. So my goal in particular, and several of my other co-curators, hasn't necessarily been to infiltrate museums per se, but to create a space where people could find a certain type of resistance and a certain type of affirmation for Black knowledge production. But I think there are a lot of individuals who are interested. We certainly do have a lot of people participating in the chats, and slowly, I think there have been some changes. Slowly, more people are thinking about the way that they collect materials and how they interpret those materials, right? So, like, for example, at the last museum that I worked at, the Michigan State University Museum, there's a whole collection of quilts. They're narrative quilts, so they have images that people have sewn or etched into them. And they have started using them to talk about the history of contemporary social issues. So there are certain small steps that people are using. They may not be institution-wide, but you can see, like, in their programming or in their curatorial things, or even sometimes hiring, they're making slow changes.
So first, thank you so much. This is really fun to hear about some of the things you've been doing. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this idea of history, not headlines, and how you think about history, a recent history, or like how far in the past does it have to be, or is it something that can be ongoing? And that's just, yeah,
I think I came up with that phrase because initially, like most museums, that was their pushback. They're like, we can't chase after every headline that comes up. And I said, I'm not asking you to chase after every headline. I'm simply pointing out the fact that racialized violence, there's a long history of it. Ferguson didn't just happen. The incident with Darren Wilson killing Mike Brown in cold blood didn't just happen out of nowhere. There's a whole set of environments that caused that to happen. And then it's not relegated to Ferguson alone. So I think my point with saying history, not a headline, is that yes, it's in the news right now, but it's something that has a much longer, trajectory. And I think that is, especially for history and culture museums, that's kind of our mission. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to use, our holdings to discuss to do a deeper dive into what is happening right now.
I'll go here and then there and then there.
Thanks so much. That was fascinating, all the different platforms. Could you talk a bit more about Doc Now? I'm very interested in that. How you're putting up images that are in a sense historically enriched, but in a sense very current, and the speed with which this is going on, and how you think about the visuals.
Right. So I'm not sure how much I can, because the app isn't released yet. Actually, I'm leaving here to go to a meeting there to kind of finalize the app. But I will say the thing that attracted, and it certainly isn't the only app that collects data from the internet, but I will say that what makes it unique is the guiding frames about how they do that. So they consult with the media makers. They're not just simply extracting or having bots extract tweets. They're actually consulting with the makers and seeing how they would like for it to be used on the internet, which is something that I was attracted to, and I think that it aligns with my ethics. I think often in public history, there's this vulturistic thing that goes on where people decide they want it to study a certain type of people, and then they extract that information whether that group wants them to or not. So that is one of the things that attracted me to Doc Now.
Hi, thank you so much. It's very interesting. I really don't know a lot about Twitter, and I also don't know a lot about museum spaces. But one of the things that I was wondering in curating these monthly chats what kind of things were you taking in mind when you decided well, I guess thinking more in particular with the moments, you had that one particular image. What kind of things do you guys take into account when you are deciding what image you want to focus on and what chat topics you want to talk about in the chat?
So actually, let me just pull it back up to make sure. Is this the one that you were talking about? How do we decide the images? Right. So for Black Twitter historians, first of all, the first mission is to highlight Black scholars. So we choose, after we choose the topic, which is usually something that is contemporary, but we're looking to historicize it, we look through who we know who has written about the subject. And then sometimes people come to us. Like sometimes people are like, look, I just wrote this book and I would like to talk about it. That has happened. And we welcome that too, because we want more people to read their work. So it's a variety of ways how we come upon the topic and which visuals we use. But we try to be compelling and we try to tell a story. We are very big on citations so that people can see the image, but then also go visit that archive that we gathered that information from. So it's a very rich document. These Storifys are very rich. You can not only, and this is kind of what we're moving towards, like analyzing the data that is, which we haven't really done yet, but the data within the Storifys is incredible because not only is it tracing like what scholars are thinking and talking about right now, it's tracing like what archives are being used right now. How do people feel about those topics or different things? So there's so many different layers of things that we can look at.
I'd like to ask about the historian part of the Twitter Storian project. We know that with this shifting terrain of media that we've been talking about most of the afternoon, this democratization due to the new technologies, we have to worry about the risk for unvetted information and the capacity for just nonsense, right? And so I'm really interested in how historians, Black historians, or even curators, who themselves feel, many do feel threatened by this new free-for-all environment.
Yeah.
How do you and others deal with this material, which is coming at this breakneck speed and that claims to historical authority without being vetted as truly, or quote unquote, truly historical?
Yeah, and I will say that was one of the hurdles in starting Black Twitter historians, because historians typically don't want anything to do with new media. I mean, now because it's kind of hot, people are getting into digital humanities, but when we were asking them to be a part of this chat, they're like, what is that? I don't know. It's not serious scholarship. But we started talking about it as a chance, as a broader classroom. So these are people who are vetted and are talking about their work. So for example, Dr. Farmer was one of the scholars that we had, and she was talking about her work in Black Power and women in the Black Power movement. So we are asking her questions, and she's answering. The people do have a chance to, ask questions and also state their piece, but we curate the Storifys. So there's not nonsense in here. So we curate it so that it's right. And it does happen. There are people who troll us, which is a whole nother issue. There are people who are just ignorant about the topic, but they can state their piece, but it just won't end up in the Storify, right? It won't end up in the archive.
So thank you for this. I just find this so fascinating, and I'm a bit of a stand for curators. I think my mother fancies herself a lay curator, but is kind of just hoarding when she does it. But I wanted to ask the question about, because this is so like close history, near history, what do you actually encourage young people in these movements in terms of the materiality, the material culture? What do you actually encourage them to preserve? And also with that, what are the challenges and struggles in terms of, this is an actively surveilled movement. People literally get rid of things, they delete tweets, they throw away stuff. What are the challenges in curating something that is very, actively and not innocuous and not, and not deep history, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that we can't ignore, is that this is a surveilled movement. I remember both Josh and I, like, after we started this, it seems like all of these police officers were following us on Twitter. So, yeah, we were definitely surveilled, and it certainly probably wasn't to the extent that many people who are actually on the ground are surveilled. But it's still resistance. Our visibility is resistance. So that's one of the things that we've committed to being visible. The second thing, in terms of the material culture, I've found that and I think I'm calling this like a Black Renaissance. Like, there are a lot of people who are really interested in learning history and how to keep it. People outside of the academy, and I think that's why Black Twitter historians grew, and why so many people were like logging in and using the hashtag or asking the scholars questions, because there really is like this deep yearning to want to learn more. So people are asking, like, how do I keep this? You say that this should go to a museum, but I don't trust that museum, so who should it go to? So I am, like, offline giving advice about, yes, keep that t-shirt, or yes, keep this note, or yes, keep this citation that you got, and here's how you preserve it until you figure out that you're willing to part with it, and who might be the best holdings for it. So, yeah, I've had a lot of those talks, and I'm very glad that more people are interested in preserving that type of history.
Is there any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.